Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual Athenaeum. I'm Dr. Fiona Glade, Dean of Communication Studies, eLab and Linguistics, and the Paul Peck Humanities Institute. I'm your host for the Athenaeum series. On behalf of Germantown Campus Interim Vice President and Provost Mohammed Kainamui, I'm honored to welcome you. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker today, Montgomery County artist Suzanne Firstenberg, who has very close ties with the college. A few outstanding colleagues have worked very hard to prepare this event. MCTV producers, Mr. Arkar Kyo-Win and Ms. Danielle Steshke, Ms. Vivian Chang, who coordinates the admin, and Professors Katima Lee and Amanda Miller, our Athenaeum faculty fellows. We're also very happy to welcome Professor Miller's class here with us today. As we gather, let's acknowledge gratefully that we're on the ancestral lands of generations of Native peoples. Acknowledgement is just one small gesture. Please join me in considering the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brought us all to this place today. You can find out more about the Athenaeum and view recordings of speakers on the Athenaeum website. Our presentation today is being recorded, and at this time, we'll close with a Q&A. Now, I'll pass the mic to Professor Megan van Wagner, who will introduce our special guest, Suzanne Firstenberg.
Hello, I'm so thrilled to be here welcoming Suzanne Brennan Firstenberg to Montgomery College and the lecture series. I first met Suzanne Firstenberg in 2011. She emailed to ask if there was a possibility of firing a very large clay figurative sculpture. It was a study of the Belvedere torso, a classical stone carving, and huge by ceramic sculpture standards, and needed to be transported and lifted and fired very slowly. And it was a technical artistic study of a figure needing a technical solution. And Suzanne was determined to make this happen. We didn't have the correct kiln or the space to safely load and fire the piece, but it sparked a relationship with the art department at Tacoma Park and its faculty, and especially former Professor Lincoln Mudd, and perhaps changed the direction of Suzanne's artistic practice. Suzanne studied business in school and holds an MBA from the University of North Carolina and was presented with an honorary degree from Montgomery College recently. She found her way to art in a community ceramics studio. She's since studied various art forms and works in many different media. As a social practice artist, she ventures beyond traditional media to broaden minds and change attitudes. She is focused on telling stories and raising consciousness through large-scale public installations and intimate artworks. In 2001, Suzanne blanketed the National Mall for 17 days with 701,000 white flags, marking a life lost to COVID-19. She's traveled, collected stories of people suffering and recovering from drug addiction, and has completed 7 installations, a series she titles Empty Fix, aimed at destigmatizing addiction. I'm super excited to hear Suzanne talk about the work she's been doing and the consciousness she is raising. And I'd like to welcome Suzanne to the stage.
Megan, thank you so much. What a fateful day it was for me when you answered your phone, when I called you about that clay sculpture. I will present information about that sculpture and much more, but I first want to mention that I have some goals here this morning. First, I want to actually inspire all of you to get uncomfortable. Whenever you have a chance, get uncomfortable. And I'll explain that in a minute. Next, I want to challenge you to think about how you can incorporate the power of art into your communications, whatever they may be. And then lastly, I hope you will leave this session today with a special sense of hope. Let me begin. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Yes, I was at Montgomery College, and it meant a great deal to me. You will learn, though, as we go through this presentation, I want you to think about how I was a student just like you. I parked in the same parking spaces likely. I sat maybe in some of the same classrooms. I could even have had some of the same professors. This story of mine could be yours. It was mine because I chose to get uncomfortable. I took classes with people who were smarter and more talented, and I've put myself since then in a lot of uncomfortable situations, some of which I will share with you. Today, what I want to do is to tell you about my involvement with Montgomery College, and I will structure all of this with questions. My first question will be, what's my tie to the college? And then there will be 4 more questions, and so you will be able to mark our progress through the questions. Now, I will tell you, Montgomery College gave me incredible tools so that I could go on to do what I have done. But you know what? First, I needed to know that I needed the tools. So my story starts clear back in South Dakota. I was born in Rapid City, South Dakota, and went to grade school and middle school there, moved to Lexington, Kentucky for high school. And then I moved again my senior year to live in Ponce, Puerto Rico. Yo viví en Puerto Rico por un año. I lived there just a year. And then I came back to the States for college. But all this time there was disruption, and I was uncomfortable moving to Kentucky and to Puerto Rico and then coming back to college. But that was a good thing, as you will see. So as Megan mentioned, I did my undergrad at UK, University of Kentucky, moved on to UNC and got an MBA. And then I went into pharmaceutical new product development. So I lived in Indiana, I lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I lived in New Jersey, and then I moved to Washington, D.C. Worked on Capitol Hill for a bit, raised 3 children, did hospice volunteering, and then I discovered that I was an artist. This story begins with my first art class. I was just curious. A professor or an instructor, I guess you'd say teacher at my son's high school, wanted to earn some extra money. And so he offered an adult ceramics class 1 evening a week in the summer. Well, I'd never done ceramics. I'd never had any art class. And so I figured, what the heck? Here you can see what fun it was for my fellow participants. But for me, it was anguish. I can just imagine Megan thinking, no, Suzanne, don't say that. But it was. I could not center my clay. Try as I might, clay was flying all over. So I said to the teacher, could I just sit at a side table and build something from scratch, like build a bust or something? And he said yes. He was very gracious about it. And at the end of the summer, I had my first art piece. Now, I looked at this and I was like, oh my God, I just wasted 50 years of my life not knowing that I could do this. But I have to interrupt myself for a minute because I must tell you, it wasn't easy. I didn't know how to put a head onto a sculpture. I had to ask for a lot of advice and get a lot of guidance. I thought I was finished with her, but the instructor said, nah, now redo the hair. So I redid the hair, and guess what? The head fell off. So finally, I did realize this sculpture, and that gave me confidence. And so I knew then that I needed to develop this skill. So the next thing I did was develop that art piece that Megan referred to. I needed to teach my hands and eyes what beauty was and how to create aesthetic beauty. So I figured, why not try to reproduce the Belvedere torso? This was a piece from Greek antiquity that was discovered in the time of Michelangelo and was thought that it had inspired Michelangelo in his painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So I figured, good enough for him, certainly good enough for me. So with 200 pounds of clay, I actually reproduced that. And while I couldn't get it fired at Montgomery College, we did put it into the car in the passenger seat and drive it up to Baltimore, where it did get fired. So interspersed in this, I'm going to give you bits of advice. Forgive me. Finding your passion begins with curiosity. Now, it may take a while to find your passion, but read, talk with strangers, be curious about things because you will find it. Just be patient. One of the things I want to mention is having gone through this myself, where I thought I knew myself, and then I discovered this ability. When I walk down the street and I see strangers, I often will say to myself, I wonder what is inside them that they haven't found yet. But I encourage you to search and continue that search because it's there. Montgomery College. Oh my God, what an experience. I took most of my classes at Tacoma Park. I took some at Rockville, and I did get to Germantown, but not for a specific class. I learned how to cast aluminum, cast bronze, how to draw. The thing you see here in the center is a microscript drawing. I learned how to draw with words. This male figure is created from the writ of certiorari and the testimony in the Windsor Supreme Court case from 2013. So I learned materials and I learned methods. But question number 2, was there a moment when it clicked for you? And there was, specifically in the class that I took with Lincoln Mudd. I think it was Sculpture 2. What Professor Mudd would do is he would instruct us with a material. For instance, in this case, I had a 16 gauge sheet of steel, and he would teach us methods. He taught me how to use a plasma cutter and how to weld. And then he would let all of the students loose, and we would try our skills, and we would create pieces of art, which we would then take into a critique class. And the critique classes were tough. I mean, you had to explain your art, and you, in some situations, you had to defend it. So my piece of art that I created was this. And when Professor Mudd looked at it, like he said to me, Suzanne, it's kitschy. It's like shiny and nice and decorative, but I'm not sure it has much to say. And I was aghast because I was so proud of my skills. And I thought, and then I gave it content. I gave it a name. It became the Dead Sea. It became seaweed, speaking to the fact that our oceans were dying. And he looked at me and gave me a smile. And that's when I understood that for me, art, the difference between art and craft was that art had something to say. My next work of art was conceived after a visit to the Apple Store. I visited the Apple Store on Bethesda Avenue, went to the Genius Bar, and had probably not a very good experience because I remember going back to my car in the parking garage and just being so unhappy. And there was a homeless man sprawled out on the sidewalk, and I went into the traffic in the street to get around him. When I got behind the wheel of my car, I said to myself, wow, I cared more about the sidewalk than I cared about that human being who doesn't have a roof over his head and probably doesn't have many square meals. And so that was the moment when I decided to use art as, in a way, a mea culpa for my bad thinking, for my screwed up values, right? So I went around and found places in Rockville, Bethesda, and Chevy Chase where they were digging up sidewalks. And I gathered concrete rubble and rebar from those torn up sidewalks, and I created a human figure, reversing and having the softness of a homeless man's blanket be the sidewalk, and showing presenting the human form made of rubble. I mentioned that I'm from South Dakota. One of the things that people think about when they think of the Black Hills is Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore was created in the 1930s, and it is carved from granite. I have tried to carve granite, and it is ridiculously hard to mold to one's desires. So what I did was I took some clay. Oh, I should finish the story. It was done in the 30s, but in 1868, the United States government gave in a treaty the ownership of the Black Hills to the Native Americans, the Sioux, the Lakota, whose land that used to be. So in this treaty, we gave them the rights, we gave them back their land, these Black Hills. But a man named Custer, who ultimately became General Custer, was leading a group of prospectors and surveyors through the area. They discovered gold, and the next thing you know, the treaty was ripped up. So in honor of this story, I recreated Mount Rushmore, but with the countenances, the images of Native Americans. My goal was to then take this clay piece, pull a mold, and cast it in ice so that there, as we're standing around in an art exhibit drinking our Chardonnay, we can watch the sculpture melt. Putting the transitory nature of that material in contrast with the longevity of granite. Now, I showed this at a Washington, D.C. sculptors group image show, and a woman there after the show walked up to me, handed me her business card and said, "Suzanne, come see me tomorrow. We need to discuss your art." Well, I had no idea what was about to happen. The next day I visited her, and she had mentioned that this was one of those images that she was particularly taken with. This was my cast aluminum piece called La Mer, and it was a self-portrait. She loved this image, and she said, "Suzanne, I would like you to be my partner in the Harbin International Ice Sculpting Competition in January." I had no idea what she was talking about. I'd never sculpted in ice. I'd never carved ice. But we gathered my portfolio, we sent it to the Chinese government, and just weeks later, I was approved. And 2 months later, I was on a plane headed to northern China. I got there, I met her, and I competed with the world's best ice sculptors. And Tatiana and I actually won the creativity prize when we recreated my cast self-portrait in ice. So it's a pretty unbelievable journey if you think. This was just 5 years after I set foot at Montgomery College. But this leads me to a point for you. Get out of your comfort zone. I'd never flown to China. When I woke up that first morning in Shanghai, I realized that I knew no one for 3,000 miles, not a soul. Finally, when Tatiana and I gathered it together in Harbin, okay, I knew her, but I realized that I was totally out of my league, comfort-wise, talent-wise, skill-wise. I was on icy 4-foot scaffolding with a chainsaw. So I say to you, get out of your comfort zone. What I brought back with me from China was so much more important than the creativity prize. I brought back confidence that I could get into a really, really bad, challenging situation and survive and maintain my dignity and learn something. So I say to you, have your own endless days at 0 degrees temperature like I did. Get out of your comfort zone because you will be astounded at what you find. I came back 2016 to the United States, and I created another art installation that was interesting. I remember I said that I had worked on Capitol Hill. I was a Senate aide for Senator Tom Daschle from South Dakota. I worked there only a short time, but I learned that the Congressional Record was a publication that was put out, and it was the codification of everything that happened on the House and Senate floor. So by getting a year subscription to the Congressional Record, what I basically got in my hands was an entire year's work of Congress, an entire year of their effort. When another threatened government shutdown was coming, I thought, oh my God, if these people were our employees, we would fire them. They get so little done. So I took this subscription to the Congressional Record. Every few days or weeks, another issue would land in my mailbox. And as I was traveling, when I would be on Amtrak, on an airplane, when I'd be waiting in a doctor's office, I would fold each of those pages into a paper airplane. People nearby offered to help. So I actually had help from people in, I think it was 12 or 13 different states. And we, at the end of that year, we exhibited Updraft America. We took those airplanes, we colored half of them red, striped the other half blue, and installed them in opposing bins. And as they rose up in squadron-like formation against each other, those planes that would bridge the political divide had their red and blue combine into purple, and they would fly out of the museum. So this was at the American University's Katzen Museum. This is one example that I want to provide you of how the material that is chosen for a work of art can go a long ways towards pulling the viewer down the communications pathway, if you will. Here's another piece of art that is really relevant to today, alienable right to life. I presented this piece in Gallery H in Washington, D.C. in August of 2019. If you look closely at the left upper hand corner of the flag, you will read the words Columbine High School. This is an American flag created from the names of mass shooting victims. I presented it in front of the image of the Declaration of Independence. When we talk about gun rights, we so often just center that discussion on the Second Amendment. But I put it in juxtaposition with the Declaration to suggest that we need to broaden that discussion to include the right to life of those who are killed. Now, quick story. As this was installed in Gallery H, it was a Saturday afternoon, August 3rd. And yes, there we were, early in the afternoon, drinking our Chardonnay and talking about this and some other pieces of art about gun violence. When people's cell phones started buzzing and ringing and people were, I looked around and everyone was just looking at their cell phones. And then someone came up to me and said, Suzanne, I'm just so sorry to tell you, there had just been a mass shooting in El Paso, Texas. This is when the Walmart shooting occurred. And then that night, if you remember, there was a mass shooting in Dayton, downtown Dayton, Ohio. So when you look at this artwork, you will see those squares, those black squares at the bottom right. I had to add names to this flag. Now, not much has been resolved since 2019 in the area of gun safety. So guess what? I am bringing this art back in large scale. On Freedom Plaza, and most people don't know this yet, so thank you for letting me be an Athenaeum speaker and providing you this preview. From May 10th to May 20th, I will be presenting this artwork large scale. It'll be 34 feet long, 24 feet high, and 9 feet wide. This is to, again, call attention to the need to broaden our discussion and have a more fulsome discussion about gun rights and the need to actually balance the need for safety against the need or the right to have access to guns. Now, mass shooting victims aren't the only category of gun violence victims. so many people die from gun accidents, domestic violence situations, and suicide. And so I will have a companion piece there on Freedom Plaza. I'm working with a local DC muralist, and we're going to create a mural in the round. So you will be able to enter this round structure, and people will be able to add other names of gun victims who they want to memorialize in this art. They will also be able to collage into it their stories about guns and gun violence and add those to the outside. So please join me on Freedom Plaza. May 10th is a Friday. It will be the opening celebration or ceremony. And that first weekend is the Mother's Day weekend, which will be particularly poignant there on Freedom Plaza. Here is a QR code. If you would like more information about it, if you would like to volunteer, reach out. I would love to have you involved in this effort. And I will provide you that QR code again at the end of our talk. So question 3, what is your medium? When I'm introduced to people as an artist, inevitably the first question I get is, what is your medium? Well, at this point, you may realize that my response is empathy. And Megan referred to one of my recent art series about the one about addiction to drugs. I call it the Empty Fix Project. What I did was, I should tell you how it began. I was the resident artist at the Bloedel Reserve on Bainbridge Island in Washington State. The Bloedel Reserve is a beautiful nature reserve of 150 acres of azalea gardens and moss gardens and a rhododendron glade. And I would wander it each day and meet the grounds crew in anticipation of my next body of work. On the grounds crew, I met a young man named Brandon. He couldn't have been more than like 23, 22. And he told me how grateful he was for his job. And I said, that's wonderful. Why is that? And he said, well, I just got out of prison, so it's hard to get a job. And I think I actually laughed, and I said to him, you're too young to have gone through all that. And he said, no. When I was in 8th grade, my mom, my single mom, wanted a way to relate to me. So she shared with me her OxyContin. I became wildly addicted and ended up selling drugs from the boys' bathroom in high school. And I was old enough to go to prison. His story really made me understand that I knew nothing about drug addiction. So I made it my next body of work. I traveled to 23, 24 different states and interviewed literally hundreds of people who were suffering or recovering from drug addiction. Here's a picture from New Jersey. This was Nick. He was outside a hospital. He'd just been released from the ER. He had been beaten up by his drug dealer the night before. So I interviewed all these people, and in each interview, I would get a picture of their eyes. I would ask them to share with me, and I would record their description of the compulsion to use. I needed to truly understand in their own words that feeling of compulsion. I had them write notes to people to better explain addiction. And so I took those various bits and pieces from each interview and created 7 installations. The first of which is called Eyes. I would take the picture of their eyes and adhere it with the resin process to glass blocks. These glass blocks are then presented only in fountains and reflecting pools. They're out in the wild, if you will. No one has to decide to come into a museum to see art about drug addiction. I wanted one of the installations in this art series to be out where people are. So here you see the eyes installed at the USC fountain, USC campus. And the reason I do this is because addiction is like drowning. When we see someone passed out on the sidewalk from addiction, we'll give them wide berth. But when we see somebody drowning. We are socialized to never walk past. And so by creating this art, what I hope to do is change even a little bit the relationship of the viewer to the art, of the passerby to the victim. One of the other, and I'll only share these two installations with you. You can go on the website to see or visit my studio to see some of the others. The next one is called Protect Them. And this emanated from one of my very early interviews. I was at a Salt Lake City homeless shelter, and I asked the man I was interviewing, young man, I said, so tell me how you got addicted. He looked at me like, oh my God, this stupid woman. And he said, Suzanne, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what door we took into this crazy circus tent. He said, whether it was smoking weed behind the school gym or an oxy script because of a sports injury, it doesn't matter. He said, what matters is what's keeping us locked in here. Don't ask how we got addicted. He said, ask why. And I stopped short. I thought, God, I never thought about why someone becomes addicted. So I began asking that question, and I was shocked that people had answers. And their answers were really ones that broke my heart. Social isolation, bullying, grief, neglect, abuse. There is rampant sexual abuse out there. They provided me stories of all kinds of abuse. So I came back to my DC studio and I thought, how can I most effectively take these stories of psychological trauma and use arts to make them matter? What I did, I bought a shipping container, 40-foot shipping container. We cut it down to 28 feet. I invited a local muralist, Rodrigo Pretel, to do the murals on both sides. I filled the shipping container with safety items, car seats, water wings, safety gates. There's 165 bike helmets in there. I created this tunnel of child safety items for people to walk through. And then I posted at that entrance, and you can see right here, I first mentioned that psychological injury underpins addiction and makes people exquisitely vulnerable. And then I make a note on the sign that Americans spend over $1 billion a year on child safety items. And I ask, are we really keeping them safe? And as people walk through this tunnel of child safety items, from 7 hidden audio speakers, they hear those stories of trauma. This art has taught me that there are ways to recover. I spoke with so many people who were actively recovering, and I talked with many people who were working at therapy and recovery centers. They taught me that there are 3 important, valuable things to a healthy and sustained recovery from addiction of any sort. First, people need counseling. They need therapy to overcome the psychological injury that is keeping them locked in addiction. They need a new community of users, one that will support them in sobriety, and they need a new self-concept. Psychological injury really damages one's self-worth. So recovery really is much easier and profoundly better when one reconceptualizes oneself and has a better sense of self to work towards. So that's what I learned from the empty fix. Now, another word of advice. I want you to trust in and really listen to your inner voice. When Brandon told me his story, my inner voice was curiosity, but it was also knowing that I needed to understand better what was going on in his world. When the pandemic started, my inner voice was shouting at me. Let me take you back to March 2020 as the pandemic began. We were locked down, and I remember reading a news report that the Texas Lieutenant Governor, Daniel Patrick, had just proclaimed that the elderly should be willing to take the risk of the virus for the sake of the economy. And I was I was really, really appalled at that. I thought, wow, when we start to devalue an entire segment of society, that's when society starts to break down. So at that point, I knew I needed to do something to fight back against this really bad approach. And I spent months trying to figure out what I would do. But when I was reading a Washington Post article in August that said the president and it's President Trump's reelection campaign was going to position the then 170,000 deaths from COVID as just a statistic, I thought, no. We have to understand that each of these lives is precious. And so I endeavored to create art that would fight back against that and that would really stand up for each person who had died in that pandemic. So I conceived of this art installation. It's called In America, How Could This Happen? I bought almost 250,000 white flags before I even had a place to plant them. But I was determined that I was going to create an artwork that would honor each individual person. So I had to have one unit of something that could stand for an individual life lost. And just to point out that something interesting that most people don't get a chance to find out, if you will look at the sign and then look beyond it to a light post and look down, there's a tiny, tiny little bit of just a few white flags standing together. I think there was like 19 of them there. And I had a sign that said that these flags, this small group of flags, shows the number of dead to date. And this was October 2020 in New Zealand. And then all those flags you see in front of the sign, those represent how many people would have died in the US if we had had the same measures, the same safety measures, and had the same social cohesion in addressing the pandemic as New Zealand had. And then visitors would walk around the sign and see the devastation of what our approach caused. This was art that happened right around the time of the election, and foreign press descended upon this art installation. Photos of it appeared on the front page of Der Spiegel in many different countries on 5 continents before people in the US even knew that it was here. So I have a little clip from the BBC that I'm going to play for you just to give you a little sense of why I created the art and just a bit about what happened when it closed. But choose any flag, and there's a story behind it. Jesse James Lowell. Lila Althea Fenwick, first Black woman to graduate Harvard Law. He died at age 40 and left behind 6 children. It just goes on and on and on. We've lost so much. I wanted to use art to explain to people the real depth and breadth of this tragedy. The number of deaths in America got so big, people were ignoring it in a way.
200,000 lives lost, 200,000 stories left unfinished.
Each one of these people mattered, and we had to find a way to bring all of that emotion into the understanding of the number. I chose flags because I wanted to have one unit for every person who had died, but I wanted it to have action. I wanted it to make noise. And flags, when they ripple in the wind, not only is there movement and beauty in that, but there's also sound. And I wanted to, in a way, bring to life this idea of those whom we've lost. I chose white for a few different reasons. First of all, people could write on them. So people could personalize a flag for the loved one whom they'd lost. But also, white individually signified purity and innocence. But on a whole, when you look at this immense field of white flags, that white really looked like what it was, and that is the flag of surrender by our government officials. I didn't want it just to be art that I made,
we're all in this together. I had to have it be art that people came and helped me with.
Each one of these bundles has 100 flags in it. We put approximately 1,000 flags into each of these boxes. So I bought 250 boxes. And I began with 250,000 and then had to order twice more. And then we ran out of space.
When it had to come down because I ran out of space and time, and in my heart I really wanted to have the art continue in some way. And so I partnered with folks at GW University, and we've created a digitized version. So people can actually go onto this map and see the flags that were planted, and then add ones for those whom they've lost to COVID. People haven't been listening to words, and so visual artists really do need to step up and fill the void. I don't think we'll ever get over this, and I don't think there's any closure. We need to make patriotism looking out for each other. And that's not on Biden, that's on us.
The art installation ended at the end of November after it had already bled over into the medians, as you see there. This picture is compliments of the producers of the movie Fauci. They filmed there the last weekend of the installation, and they graciously provided me this image. And yes, Dr. Fauci and his wife did visit this art installation. So did people from the National Park Service and people from the Trust for the National Mall. And they said to me, Suzanne, you really need to take this to the National Mall. Let me interrupt, though, with another word of advice. You know, people always say, learn from your failures. But I say, learn also from your successes. Don't just, you celebrate them, yes, but learn why what you have done has touched people. I realized when this was a success and when it moved people so greatly that there was a need for the art, that it was important. And so I did make the effort and find a way to bring it to the National Mall. It was then presented the next fall, beginning September 17th, 2021, and that it went through October 3rd. It was large-scale data visualization. This is that need to physically manifest for people to understand. Folks were overwhelmed. When we first began planting, someone came up, we'd only done maybe a third of one of these squares, and someone came up and said, oh, is this going to be for 9/11? 9/11 would only fill a third of one of those squares. It was an opportunity for people from around the country to come and honor their loved ones lost. It was a national place of mourning. The National Mall was for those 17 days. People came from all over the country to dedicate flags. Let me just interrupt here for 1 minute. Back at the RFK Memorial, there was a woman from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who felt desperate to come and dedicate flags at that installation. She couldn't get a direct flight, so she did something like she flew to Pittsburgh and then had to rent a car, and she drove in the pouring rain to come and dedicate 4 flags. She dedicated those flags and then she drove back. That's the power of art. When someone will come that far and make that much of an effort to write on a 4 by 5 inch piece of poly, that's art. That overwhelmed me. And so to honor all that grief from around the nation, it was really imperative to do this on a larger scale and to offer more people the opportunity to acknowledge their loved ones lost. These were lives that ended often in isolation and oftentimes without memorialization, as would normally have happened if there had not been a pandemic. Also, though, this art, in addition to being large-scale digital visualization, and also from being a memorial or an opportunity to honor loss, I wanted it to be a moment for our nation just to pause. I wanted it to be so visually arresting that people would go, oh my God, and really think about this tragedy. Just a couple numbers that are interesting. We had, after just the first 3 days of the installation, a media exposure report that noted the art had been seen by over 1.8 billion people worldwide. That's the power of the share button. We had in person 1.2 million visitors. The art covered 20 acres of the National Mall, and it took almost 1,000 volunteers to accomplish it. So, question number 4. People always ask, how did you do this? Well, because you're here with me today, I'm going to share something that doesn't often get seen. It doesn't speak well to my MBA because this is not the best organizational chart, but this is the In America team. We were all centered around the actual art. If you look in the the bottom, that you see the National Park Service. I had to buy flags. I needed graphic design for the signage. We needed the help of Rupert Landscaping to actually get all these flags planted, volunteers, Esri, which I'll talk about in a minute. We needed a website. The list goes on and on. It was incredible. But the most important part of this was that everyone on the team was mission driven. And that's how we got it done. This is the original design. And here it is, actualized. We began planting right across 15th Street from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. I did this specifically because so many lives of color were lost, especially in the first months of the pandemic. Thank God for Rupert Landscaping. I could not have done it without them. We started on a Tuesday morning at 4 a.m. and we started the surveying, and they laid out beautiful rows and squares and did so much of the planting. They even devised 2 different devices for planting in an array. Planting in an array was important to me because the visual would echo Arlington Cemetery, white markers on green grass. We had many reception tables because the visitors needed to have support in dedicating flags. We teamed up with Esri, which is an international supplier of geographic information system software. They do mapping software. They're the people on whom USPS, UPS, and many companies rely on for their mapping software. We created a website where people could go if they didn't have the privilege of the time and money to come all the way to DC to dedicate a flag for their loved one. I wanted them to have a way to participate. And so they could go onto the website and submit a dedication. That dedication was printed out in Bethesda, carried down to the National Mall. Volunteers at tables would write out those flags. We would proof them and then plant them. After that, a terrific team of students and faculty from GW University would geolocate the flags. This means they would download the Esri software onto their phones. They would take a picture of a flag that had been dedicated through the website. They would affix that flag photo to the file for that flag, and then they would push a button and it would automatically geolocate so that a few days after submitting the message, a person, say in where, like Denver, could go back onto the website. They could put in the name of their loved one, and they would see exactly within these 147 squares of flags, their flag was flying. they would also see a picture of it. This was the way in which we honored the grief from every American who wanted to participate, not just from those who had the privilege of being in the area and being able to visit the installation. I'll share with you just a few of those flags. Olga Camacho. I'm a great-grandma, grandma, mother, daughter, wife, and friend. I worked on the Endeavour, sending astronauts to space. Annabelle Carter. To the best kid ever, thanks for being ours, Anna. The world was better because you were in it. Catherine Kitty Rochlin. I begged you in May to get the shots. You dismissed me with God will protect me. The vaccine is from God. You passed the end of July. Dr. Samuel Harris Gray, he gave me life and saved many others. I love you, Dad. Oscar Rene Lozoya Hierro, a Mexican immigrant, proud to be an American and raised his family here. And this last one, Andrew E.R. Dixon Jr. As I was walking through the flags one day, I saw a man planting this flag, and he shared with me his sorrow. His father had died, but he had never taken the time to teach his son what it meant and how to be the patriarch of the family. So much was lost. Seeing an image of the flags is nothing like having been there. And so we commissioned a 15-minute documentary short so that we would be able to immortalize those moments in the flags. This is a documentary. I am not in it. There is no voiceover. It is simply 15 families dedicating flags to their loved ones who had died from COVID. We had a closing ceremony. It was just beautiful. At sunset on October 3rd, we read some of the flags and had faith leaders provide prayers and homilies. And then a military bugler played taps, and the installation ended. A lot of people ask me what the flags taught me, and they taught me a lot. I have so many stories, and maybe in the Q&A, I'll be able to share some of those. But let me just share with you just maybe four things that the flags taught me. One, they taught me to go big or go home. If you're going to do anything, put your soul into it, put a piece of you in it, and do it to the very best you can. Number two, America does not provide this space, the psychic space, the physical space, the emotional space for the grief of men. One of the things I found most profoundly moving was the number of men crying amidst those flags. It taught me that we have to honor men and to provide them in particular more space, more acknowledgement, and more acceptance of their grief. Let me start this lesson with a story. And you know that I changed the number on the large signature sign each day around noontime. I would update it based on Johns Hopkins University cumulative death toll numbers. So on a day when I was in the middle of the flags, a woman, big blonde woman, came bustling over to me and said, "Are you Suzanne?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "You need to take the flag out that represents my mother, because my mother, she went into the hospital with COVID, but she died from a heart attack. And I want you to take her flag out right now." And I looked at her, I looked at the flags, I looked at the sign, and I thought, man, I worked so hard to have the same number of flags as on the sign. And if I take out one, and I'm going to have to change that sign. But the sign is rooted in the data, the facts that Johns Hopkins gave me. So I was looking like a deer in the headlights, and then the dime dropped. Then I understood. I stepped a bit closer to her and I said, tell me what your mother's name was, because you must have really, really loved her. What was her name? And she said, Mary. And I said, please, can you share a little bit about Mary with me? You must have loved her so much. And she looked at me as though I was kind of crazy at first. But then she started to tell me about Mary. And she shared several stories, several facts about her mother. And she talked and talked. And when her grief was spent, she looked at me, said, thank you. And she walked away. What she taught me was that anger oftentimes really isn't anger. It's another emotion dressed up as anger. And in her case, it was grief. I named this art In America Remember because when I green-lighted it with the National Park Service at the end of February in 2021, vaccines were going into arms. By September, when we were going to install, people would be back at school, people would be back at their work, and those folks, those families who had lost loved ones in the pandemic, they didn't have any normal to go back to. So when everybody else was talking about getting back to normal, they wouldn't have a place to go. That's why I was bringing the art back to the National Mall that's why I named it In America Remember. So look at this graph. There in March, the deaths were falling precipitously. But then in July, Delta arrived. And that's when there was this huge ramp up in mask refusals, in vaccine refusal, and the death toll skyrocketed. The art began with 666,000 dead. And each day I changed the number. And each day of that 17-day installation, I had to add approximately 2,000 more flags to meet that Johns Hopkins number that kept rising and rising. And I'll tell you, some information from Kaiser Foundation led me to understand that 75% of the deaths that fall happened in those who were unvaccinated, whether they didn't get vaccinated enough, or they just couldn't avail themselves of the vaccine, or they refused to take it. Here you see, this is the last time I changed the number, and the art installation ended at 701,000. I was reeling at the end of that. After Taps was played and after we gathered all the flags, I sat in my studio and I wondered, why? Why did people not keep themselves safe and or those around them? I had to understand why the pandemic got politicized, because public art should never, never be politicized. I did a lot of reading, and one of the books I was reading, it was about science denial. It's called Denying to the Grave. And in it, Jack and Sarah Gorman note that when someone encounters information that supports their ideological or political beliefs, it actually triggers a dopamine surge in their brains. And I realized this is what was happening in the brains of all those people I had interviewed who had been suffering from drug addiction. The dopamine surge in their brains began a chemical chain reaction. And I thought, oh my goodness, maybe people at the political extremes, maybe they are addicted. So I went back to the definition of addiction. Addiction is the compulsive consumption of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self or others. And I thought there's no greater harm than having a white flag planted for yourself because your beliefs became so extreme that you wouldn't take safety measures. So I kept thinking about this Tolerance is a symptom of addiction that is used in its diagnosis. Tolerance is when, for instance, with drug addiction, you need more and more of the drug to reach the same physiologic effect. That's tolerance. So I wondered, maybe tolerance, if you're addicted to political extremist messaging, maybe that is why people can believe such outlandish things. So I researched further, and indeed, researchers in Berlin, Toronto, and Stockholm have found that greater dopamine availability in the brain leads one to have a stronger propensity to believe unfounded things. In other words, people with high circulating dopamine levels are significantly more likely to believe in things like conspiracy theories. This to me made sense. Now it was all coming together. Addiction to political extremism could cause people to believe that George Bush knew that 9/11 was going to happen, that complete political party is comprised of satanic pedophiles, that Bill Gates wanted to infuse the COVID vaccines with microchips. For further confirmation, I talked with one of the world's leading experts on radicalization, Dr. Jocelyn Berlinger in Addis Ababa, and he explained to me that radicalization happens when a person's need for self-worth, when their need for personal significance becomes so pressing and so huge that it elbows out all other types of needs. And this comports with what Dr. Gabor Mate notes in his book, The Myth of Normal, in which he explains how psychological trauma really devastates a person's self-worth. It makes sense. Certain people are made vulnerable to addiction in this manner. And so I used the framework of addiction, combining what I learned from the flags and what I learned from the empty fix, and it makes sense to me. I just want to put a big asterisk here. I am an artist. I am not a medical professional. I am not a therapist. I am simply providing my view of this based on my art. But it helps me to understand that individuals who knowingly distribute disinformation so they can get more powerful, gain more influence or money, to me, they're drug dealers. Organizations providing them a platform and benefiting from disinformation and causing such havoc, they're the cartels in this framework. And those who are compulsively seeking and consuming extremist messaging to such an extent that it causes harm to themselves or others, you know what? They just need our help. Remember what I was talking about, the pillars of recovery from addiction. For all those who are extreme in our lives, and I'm not talking about people who just hold strong views, I'm talking about people whose lives are seriously affected, who've lost relationships, lost jobs because of extremism. They need counseling to deal with the psychological trauma. It's hard to get people into counseling, and there's not a lot of it available. And so maybe just starting out by listening to those people in your lives, just listening to them and encouraging them to share their stories of trauma. Community. Instead of ignoring people who are at the extremes, we don't have the luxury of doing that any longer. To save our democracy, we need to provide them community. We need to invite them back in and provide them a warm, welcoming community. And we need to help them see beyond their self-identities as political people, political animals. We need to search beneath that political veneer and help them rediscover who they really are. So, and when I talk with groups about this, I say, let's just go on zone defense. Only be responsible for those people in your life who you can reach out to, maybe who you erased from your contact list. I say, reset that place at the Thanksgiving Day table. Be welcoming. And when you do, don't talk politics. When we talk politics with somebody who's got extremist views that are causing harm, we really are challenging their self-worth. So don't talk politics. Instead, set a common goal, do something together, learn a language together, plan a trip, start a pickleball team, do fantasy football, do something together. And that stops the othering. Mostly, I want you to have hope. Because if we can do this, if we create empathy for people who are at the extremes, and even if we drag them just a little bit back from the edge of the cliff, there's hope. We've created hope. I gave a TEDx talk about this, and that led to me giving a talk at the American Democracy Summit in Los Angeles last September, talking about this personal theory of mine. I have teamed up with a New York City addiction therapist, and we are piloting a support group for family members of people who have fallen off the political extremist cliff. Because in this way, we can start helping families. And then you see the American Promise logo in the corner. I'm also working with the American Promise Group. This is a nonprofit organization that is working to have a new constitutional amendment to get money, big money, foreign money, dark money out of politics. I share all this with you to say, I want you to find your passion like I have. Fearlessly develop your skills, and then flip your camera. When I'm in an art museum, I see people taking selfies, so they're blocking the view of the art. I think, oh my gosh, we need to flip our cameras, and instead of looking inward, look outward. Here I am, reach out to me, check out my website, volunteer, come visit me at the studio, and let's talk about finding your hidden passion.